Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. This is, as you know, the second of a series of 3 Castle Lectures. The Castle Lectures are the signature lecture series for the undergraduate ethics, politics, and economics major at Yale. They are made possible by a very generous support from John Castle in honor of his ancestor, James Pierpoint, who was one of the founders of Yale. And we're very pleased that John Castle takes an interest in this lecture series and is here today, and we thank you for Now, of course, the purpose of this lecture series is to help us think about ethics in a systematic and scholarly way, how ethics is intertwined with some of the most important political and economic questions of our day. And one person who's been working in this area for, did you say 37 years?
That was even
That's from childhood. She's been working on this since childhood, is Kathryn Sikkink. She is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she's the author of many books on this subject, including most recently, I think it's hot off the press or not even off the press
No, it's
yet.
off the press.
Okay, it's off the press. You can find this now in your closest bookstore. Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work for the 20th Century.
21st century.
21st, even better. And something else you should know is that this lecture series culminates in a book that will come out with Yale University Press in another year or so, right, Kathryn? So stay tuned for that as well. But you are here at Creation, and what Kathryn helped us think about yesterday was how to think about not just rights but also responsibilities. Not just human rights, but how are we responsible for human rights? And today I think she's going to come back to that topic a little bit before talking about a very particular kind of right, voting rights, and what are our responsibilities vis-a-vis voting rights. So Kathryn, so glad you're here, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Frances, and thank you, Mr. Castle. It is a great honor, actually, to be here to deliver the Castle Lectures, and even more of an honor to have you in the audience. So thank you. And to have other distinguished friends and colleagues in the audience as well, so thank you for coming. Yesterday, I spoke of the history of rights and duties, and I made an argument that basically from its birth, human rights had gotten separated from explicit statement about individual responsibilities and duties. And I argued that we needed to somehow rediscover or recover the role of individual responsibilities in our human rights scholarship, in our human rights activism, and human rights work. But I made it very clear I wasn't interested in legal responsibilities. I don't want to reopen human rights treaties up again and somehow insert legal responsibilities. I'm talking about ethical responsibilities. I'm talking about political responsibilities. And and yesterday I talked about cosmopolitan duties we have by way of our social connection to global problems, including climate change. I had my international relations hat on. Today I'm going to speak also as a scholar of democracy and human rights to address civic duties in democracies, and especially the civic responsibility to vote. Now, as an international relations scholar, I work mainly on norms, on transnational advocacy networks, and on the power and effectiveness of human rights. So you may wonder, what am I doing talking about a topic of today about the civic duty to vote, or tomorrow about free speech and the right to protest? But I'm mainly interested in, my work has really been devoted over the long term to understand the way social change occurs globally and in the United States over long periods of time, and the role of changes in norms and beliefs in those processes of change. So in my previous books, for example, Activists Beyond Borders, that I wrote with Margaret Keck, or the Justice Cascade that looked at human rights prosecutions, I traced the history, sometimes the deep history, of important norms and campaigns that have reshaped our world. So as I approach rights and responsibilities, including the responsibility to vote, I do so as a scholar of norms and ideas. Okay, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not talking about making legal changes, and I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not talking about how we can theorize obligation or duty in a non-ideal world. Okay, I'm going to talk about the practical politics of norm construction and the non-ideal world, and the importance of norms about responsibility for voting and for participation, and then tomorrow about free speech and protest. Now, I'll argue that we do not yet have strong and well internalized norms in this country about the responsibility for voting, since 40% of eligible voters don't vote. But it's possible to think about how to build norms for the civic responsibility to vote. And in this sense, I'm talking about responsibility at two levels. Responsibility for some norm entrepreneurs to work on constructing a norm of responsibility about the responsibility of individuals to vote. Okay, so there's sort of this double layer of thinking about responsibility. Now, I've learned a thing or two about processes of norm construction and enforcement in my previous research. So first, in international relations, we define norms as standards of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. So when we talk about norm change, we mean how do we change our standards about what's the appropriate behavior? And I've studied historical norm campaigns, starting with the anti-slavery campaign, campaigns about women's suffrage, and some quirky historical campaigns that actually I've learned a lot from, like the history of the abolition of foot binding in China, or early campaigns against female genital cutting in Africa. And then I've also looked, of course, at more modern campaigns in the sense of the emergence of human rights norms in the 20th century, and then some of the more specific campaigns around specific norms, including campaigns for individual criminal accountability for mass atrocity. Now, each of the campaigns I studied began with powerful agency of individuals and groups who struggled in the face of what would appear to be insurmountable structural odds. Okay. And so people often say, oh, you keep talking about agency, but you keep ignoring the structural odds. And that's a bias I have because of the kind of change I'm interested in studying. And because all of my research over decades now, every time I look at a new norm that I want to say, where did that come from? And I start tracing it back, I always find a story of individuals and of agency and of groups who organize, and people think very often that they are certifiably insane when they start working, and in some cases, and that's the issue, in some cases they're able to bring these campaigns to be very, very successful agents of change. So much so that they convert what is kind of the craziness of the initial demand into the taken for granted notion of a norm. Because a well-internalized norm, once I've looked at something that I call the norm life cycle, right? You have norms emerge at a certain stage, but if these early norm entrepreneurs succeed, they get to a point where you have a process of norm internalization. And what happens with a norm is it begins to be taken for granted. And instead of norm entrepreneurs, you really have processes of conformity that start to work. It's the thing to do, and people begin to conform to that norm. And if you have a really well-internalized norm, at the end, you have something that is so taken for granted we don't even discuss it. So for example, we don't discuss today whether, except in Saudi Arabia, whether women should vote or not, right? And in fact, if someone tries to discuss it, they will receive social sanctions, because that's what happens when you have norm violation, is you get social sanctions. That's not a topic that we talk about. Okay. So the norm entrepreneurs. So there's these two. I mean, there's multiple stages. I think of sort of two stages: stage of norm entrepreneurs who are very principled people and and usually, if successful, strategic as well. Okay, so sometimes you think, oh, these are just kind of the pie in the sky principled people, but the ones who really succeed tend to be both simultaneously principled and strategic about how to move their norm campaign ahead. So for that reason, I'm very interested in agency. Now, my colleagues have over the years sometimes reminded me that I'm ignoring structural factors. And I still remember when I just started working on anti-slavery, and a colleague came up and she said, well, of course, you know slavery was ended because it was no longer profitable. Okay. So I dug into the literature, and what I discovered was, to the contrary, there's an immense literature on the end of slavery, but Robert Fogel, who's one of the people who's really written a pretty definitive work on it, says, to the contrary, slavery was ended at the height of its profitability by people aflame with moral fervor. So that, you know, I continue to place a lot of importance on agency in terms of initiating norm campaigns. But eventually, you have to talk about how do you move to a process of norm internalization and get to a process of conformity. Okay, so now, so there's a second reason why I'm interested in norm change and agency, and it's partly just when you reach a certain point of your life. And when you're a senior scholar, all of a sudden you can just personally, you're a witness of very dramatic norm change in your lifetime, right? And so I always point out that, you know, when I first started studying political science, there were no women in my department at Columbia University. It wasn't, really clear if I could get a job as a tenured political science scientist in a research university, much less at Harvard. And I see Francis nodding because we were in graduate school at the same time, and that was an issue, But there were a whole series of other issues. Some of them would seem kind of superficial, but that my children today don't believe that everyone smoked everywhere all the time, including in closed spaces with children, that nobody's parents buckled their children into seatbelts. Indeed, there were not seatbelts in the back seat, and we all crawled over to hang out in the back with the dog. That the notion of recycling didn't exist. And so in our lifetime, we've also seen these major and other may seem superficial but important changes in norms. And we can study, we have some idea of how those things happened, right? Like I have an argument about smoking, which is that, smoking started to really change when research on passive smoke came around, right? So as long as you were just doing, as long as you were doing stupid things to your own body, you couldn't get norm change. As soon as it was you were doing stupid things to somebody else's body, you started to see real movement on norms. And this is something that Harold Coe and his brother Howard Coe have really been working on nowadays, about trying to take the revolution we've had on norms on smoking in this country and elsewhere and see if it can really be transported to other parts of the world where that norm revolution is yet to happen. But I don't have just a rosy view of norm shift, because there have been other issues where I've seen a lot of backlash, rollback and backlash. For example, I've worked a lot on the issue of torture, and in this country, as you know, we've seen a movement back on what we thought was a well-institutionalized norm against torture, and instead we find that it is not well-institutionalized. Previously, whatever was going on, state officials would not stand up and defend torture publicly, and nowadays that has been commonplace. But more importantly, I want to talk about the mark that my research and my lived time in Latin America has had on my views about norms, about beliefs, and about democracy and voting. Okay, because really the experience that most shaped me in terms of my thinking about democracy and voting was really living in and working in and researching Latin America at a time when the entire region was under very vicious authoritarian regimes. So for those of you who were here yesterday, you remember I talked about Latin Americans in 1948 making these amazing contributions to human rights through the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man. But the next stage is that by 1950s, virtually all the countries of the region were turning into quite authoritarian regimes. And it's good to be at Yale to talk about this, because I learned a lot from some of the democracy scholars who worked here at Yale, comparative democracy scholars, people like Juan Lintz, Al Stepan, and of course, Dahl. But so I still recall when I was getting ready to go down to, as a college student, down to Uruguay in 1976, where the New York Times called it the torture chamber of the Americas. And because a larger percentage of the population of Uruguay was in prison than in any other country of the world. Okay? And I remember thinking, what is happening? How is it possible that Uruguay, that had been democratic virtually through the entire 20th century, so we're not talking about a banana republic here. We're talking about a country that had a long democratic tradition, that had a welfare state, that had high education levels, that had good income levels, and nevertheless suffered this brutal coup in '73 and had become the torture chamber of the Americas. So I was saying, what went wrong in Uruguay? And that was a puzzle that people like Juan Lintz, Al Stepan, and others were trying to answer. And ultimately, one of the most important conclusions that these democracy scholars reached, and after decades of research on the rise and fall of democracy, is that norms and beliefs about the legitimacy of democracy mattered. And Juan Lintz started very early on this topic because he insisted on the importance of legitimacy as an important factor here. And so he reminded us that the legitimacy of democracy was essential for its continuity. And for Lintz, the institution was not illegitimate just because we can imagine a preferable ideal. Okay, it was illegitimate. It was legitimate compared to other institutions that could, in reality, be established. So Lintz argued that intellectuals play a major role in formatting, elaborating, and transmitting ideas about legitimacy. In Latin America at the time, both the left and the right, including intellectuals and social movements, contributed to the delegitimation of democracy. And the work of Lintz and Stepan has been carried on, by the way, I want to say, since I'm talking about Al Stepan, some of you may know Al Stepan died last week. And I just want to remember his contributions. The first time I came to Yale was a conference on the authoritarianism in Argentina and Uruguay. I was not even in graduate school yet. I was working at a human rights organization. And it's just a tribute to who Al Stepan was as a scholar, that he kind of would invite kind of a stray human rights person and not treat them as a second-class citizen in his conference on Uruguay and Argentina. But people took up Lintz's work and Stepan's work, and particularly Scott Mainwaring, a colleague of mine at Harvard Kennedy School, has now done what I consider the definitive work on the rise and fall of democracy in Latin America. And his main explanation, okay, there are two main explanations, and I can't go into them, but they are very carefully operationalized and measured. Okay, the main explanation is the belief in democracy that key political actors have in the country. And he did that by measuring political party statements and all sorts of statements of various actors about democracy. And the second factor is the atmosphere, the international atmosphere within which countries are operating. And so the issue then becomes, if democracy failed in Latin America in part because people stopped believing in it, why did people stop believing in democracy? And what made them start believing again? People stopped believing in democracy because the real world democracy in the region fell short of their ideals. Okay? The left dreamed of a more participatory, egalitarian democracy, and they disdained the pale substitute that they called bourgeois democracy. Meanwhile, the US government and the right in Latin America also stopped believing in democracy, which they saw as a dangerous context for the spread of communism. And the US worked to overthrow leftist leaders in the region, including some that had been democratically elected. And so in this sense, we had the U.S. failure to tolerate democratically elected governments led to a spiral, basically, where the left decided that you couldn't come to power through elections because you'd be overthrown. And so the left decides that they have to turn to armed struggle as a way to promote the ideal form of democracy that they believe never has existed. And so the confrontation of armed revolutionaries and anti-communist authoritarian produced a body count of dead and disappeared in Latin America in the 1970s and 80s that had not been seen in most countries since the colonial period. So, when I speak of a responsibility to vote, it is just one of a whole series of civic responses and practices by which we affirm our belief and support of democracy. And that when we think about the legitimacy of our political system, we need to compare our evaluation of democracy to other actually existing political systems and not just to one's ideals. I know that this is an old citation and people are tired of hearing it, but I got the exact Churchill citation, at least the exact citation. We hear it sometimes, and it is this, quote, "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said," so Churchill is citing somebody else here, but we don't know who. "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." So I also found, though, a new appreciation of democracy and human rights watching my colleagues in Latin America as they rediscovered democracy and as they rediscovered human rights as a crucial part of democracy. And so human rights organizations began to reevaluate democracy and embrace human rights. As my Argentine colleague Elizabeth Helin described in Argentina, quote, "Human rights became the key element of a proposal for construction of a more humanist, tolerant, and pluralist democratic culture. For many activists, human rights protections and the value of democracy became a genuine conviction, not just a useful slogan. And during this period, the Latin American left moved away from revolution and towards more reformist solutions. The stability of democracy in the region today, and there are some exceptions like Venezuela, of course, but in most of the region, stability of democracy is, I think, largely the result of stronger normative preferences for democracy, partly born of this experience of harsh authoritarianism." Okay, so this leads me back to the topic for today. When I see the kinds of arguments for violence that are being made by some of the Antifa, right, which is short for militant anti-fascists, I don't see anything new or revolutionary. I see something all too familiar and I believe dangerous. And when I see social movements of both the right and the left in this country contributing to such extensive delegitimation of the state that it has become an act of political symbolism not to vote, it appears to me similar to the way that Latin America stopped believing in democracy, thus contributing to its fall. So in August 2017, a national survey of 1,700 current undergraduate students in U.S. four-year colleges found that 19% of students agree that it's acceptable for student groups to use violence to prevent a speaker from making offensive and hurtful statements. This is really quite a high percentage, if you believe, as I do, that such violence is not only ethically unacceptable, but also ineffective in persuading broader publics to align themselves with the goals of the movement. How did we reach a point in our society where 19% of undergraduates think violence is acceptable to stop speech? In a new paper, a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School has argued that at least some parts of three very distinct social movements, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party, and Black Lives Matter, some parts, I'm not saying no, some parts of these movements contributed to reinforcing the broad idea of the illegitimacy of the state, an idea that was central to the 2016 presidential election. Okay, so Trump came to power based on a story of the illegitimacy of the state. This story, paradoxically, was shared and shaped by movements of the left. So first let me clarify, and as I explained yesterday, when I talk about responsibility, I'm not talking about legal liability. I'm not talking about blame or causality. Okay, so I'm not going to go back and say who is to blame for anything. There's a difference between you have a responsibility and you are responsible. The second appears to suggest causality or blame, where the first is an ethical and political statement. I will be arguing that we have responsibilities, not about who is responsible. Okay, Instead, I'm using what Iris Marion Young called a social connection model of responsibility, and what my co-author Fernando Berrión del Valle and I have called networked responsibility. The idea that all people connected to a structural injustice or other human rights problem and who are in a position to act have an ethical responsibility to take action. Now, and that would include an ethical responsibility, I'm arguing, to take action around issues of voting. Now, in speaking of rights and individual responsibilities, especially around voting, we revive a debate in the social sciences about structure and agency. So there's a long-standing belief that stressing individual responsibility and agency in the face of the much greater impact of systemic and structural factors is naive at best, perhaps pernicious at worst. So some people think that too much attention to individual responsibility may distract or diminish our attention from the real or structural causes of injustice and from the responsibility of the state, our political parties, our economic system, etc., for our predicament. But I'm a political scientist. I totally understand the arguments. I know about the way that our presidential system with single-member districts and a winner-take-all voter system leads to two parties struggling to attract swing votes at the center. Such a two-party system is less likely to make, to reach out to the broad range of voters in this country and really make arguments that motivate those people to vote. So, when I talk about this, and including when I talk with my son about this, my sons, they say, the Democratic Party, did nothing to mobilize the youth. The problem is the Democratic Party, right? They voted, of course. I'm not saying they didn't vote, but there was a sense that, the system is to blame, the parties are to blame, the candidate is to blame, everyone's to blame, not people who basically they give their friends a pass who didn't vote. So I could go on about the problem with certain kinds of money in our system, the problem of the Electoral College. You've heard it all, right? The problem that we don't have a vacation day for our elections, the problem with our voter registration system. We know about voter suppression. I'm not trying to minimize any of this. I'm simply trying to say that that responsibility, individual responsibility, is still crucial for voting. Exactly because an individual decision to vote is, according to many political scientists and economists, irrational. It's irrational they say, for any individual to go and vote because our vote will not count for anything. So it needs to be motivated by something other than self-interest and rationality. So it needs to be motivated by a belief, I think, in civic responsibility. And in fact, economic theorists of voting are usually expressed surprise that the voting rates are so high. So we look at 60%, which was the turnout in the last election, in the 2016 election, 60% of eligible voters voted. And we say, that's really low. But if you're an economic theorist of democracy and you think voting is irrational, you go, what are all those people doing voting when they know that their vote won't make any difference? Now, on the irrational voting, I want to tell you about some political science friends of mine, a married couple, to illustrate what I mean. My friends went to vote in the primary of the Democratic Party. He was going to vote for Bernie, she was going to vote for Hillary. So they could have stayed home because they were going to cancel one another out. But they believed in civic responsibility to vote, so they persisted. They went to the polls. They were told they couldn't vote because the records show they had voted in the Republican primary in the previous election. Well, they certainly didn't vote in the Republican primary. This friend was one of the people who first explained to me what it meant to be a blue dog Republican. I didn't know that term. And she explained to me, she said, that means you would vote for a blue dog as long as he was a Democrat. And so they protested forcefully. And they were promised that the voting station would look into it and they should come back later in the afternoon and inquire. When they returned later afternoon, they discovered that their persistence in their irrational decision to vote had helped their local voting board discover a major malfunction in their software, a malfunction that had disenfranchised hundreds of voters. Okay, so in this case, the personal agency motivated by a sense of responsibility was actually necessary to help find and address a systemic problem in their voting system. So I take this, and I take this, I believe, from Hannah Arendt, but I have an Arendt scholar in the audience, so she'll tell me that even in situations where structures are powerful and determine outcomes, personal action is possible, necessary, and cannot be practically useless, at least in the long term. This poses issues of personal responsibility for all of us. And Arendt argues we cannot retreat from that responsibility by stressing what we know about theories of structural causality. Near the end of Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, she refers directly to the theories that may serve as reasons to dismiss personal responsibility. She writes, I quote, "Another such escape from the area of ascertainable facts and personal responsibility are the countless theories based on non-specific abstract hypothetical assumption, from the zeitgeist down to the Oedipus complex, which are all so general that they explain and justify every event and every deed. No alternative to what actually happened is even considered, and no person could have acted differently from the way he did act. All these cliches have in common that they make judgment superfluous, and to utter them is devoid of all risk." So I actually am less harsh about theory than she would be. I don't dismiss theory. I think we have to constantly take everything we know about theory to actually inform our activism, right? Because we're going to be more strategic in getting people to vote if we understand exactly what are the forces and the structures that are suppressing voting. But I believe, as I think Arendt has said there, that we must be cautious not to let theory justify action or inaction or imply that no alternative to what actually happened is possible. We still have to make judgments about what is right and wrong, as well as what works and doesn't work. Citizens are most fully realized through their work together. So I don't want to say by talking individual judgment, and here again, following Arendt, we have to realize that citizens are most fully realized in their work together in the public sphere. And that work includes both the work of defending rights, our own and those of others, and of exercising responsibility. Now, in this country, we talk a lot about the right to vote. We believe we have a right to vote and we have a right not to vote. But we don't speak very much about the civic duty to vote or civic responsibility to vote. The concept of a duty to vote is even denigrated by some. And as you'll gather, I believe strongly we have a civic duty to vote. And it's a response to the many rights and privileges that we have as citizens. It is not a very big expectation that given the rights and privileges of citizenship, that we might exercise the duties of citizenship, voting foremost among them. Of course, we want that our participation in our political life to go way beyond just voting, okay? So no, I'm certainly not saying, oh, voting's enough, or voting is, no, I'm saying voting is just a minimal starting point, but that is a necessary piece of what we hope is a much broader form of participation. Now, as Iris Young argues, this responsibility, this, as she said, social connection responsibility, is not primarily backward-looking, as the attribution of guilt or fault is, but rather forward-looking. So our question is, when we look forward to voting, how can we work together to transform norms and practices? One short-term forward-looking issue is the 2018 election, for example. While presidential elections get all the attention, in the last midterm election in 2014, 80% of young eligible voters, that's young means people here aged 18 to 29, stayed home. 80% stayed home. So the 2018 midterm election is a very concrete forward-looking issue that we have on our radar screen. Now, to start talking about how we can start building norms about a responsibility to vote, I want to start with my colleagues, professional political scientists. Just the other day, I had yet another conversation with yet another professional political scientist who doesn't vote and who offers the argument that voting is irrational. This reminded conversations I've had with two other political science colleagues over the years, two very different theoretical orientations about the decision not to vote. One said he believed voting was irrational. He went a step further. He always assigned to his students a text about the irrationality of voting in every class he taught in American politics, usually near the election. Okay, so at least inadvertently discouraging them from choosing to vote. Another colleague said he thought the structures of capitalism and the influence of money in the U.S. political system was so powerful that it was just useless, but perhaps pernicious to vote. So how can I respond to these professors and to the students who take their classes, and thus feel more than justified. And if your political science professor tells you he doesn't vote, in this case I'm using he because they were all he's, if he doesn't vote, then that's like, it's almost like a carte blanche for you not to vote as well. Now, so one way to proceed is to start with progress about what is already happening. And in the last election, 60% of eligible voters voted. That was up 1.2% from 2012. That's something many of us didn't initially understand when we saw the results of the election. Although only 50% of youth voted, that's again 18 to 29, there was an increase in youth voting by 5 points between 2012 and 2016. So that's a big increase. And if we look at college voters, the numbers are very, very interesting. And I want to spend some time with college voters because here we are at a university. First, there's a new research project on college voting that's producing some of the very best data we have on voting. The Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University is producing the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement about college voting. It's called NSOLV. So I'm going to just use that NSOLV. Okay, what I mean, the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. It involves a survey of almost 10 million college students found in 1,000 higher education institutions in the USA across all 50 states. Participating institutions give NSOLV permission to use their student enrollment records to be matched to public voting records, yielding precise data about their students' turnouts while scrupulously protecting the identity of those individuals. Okay? The demographics of these nearly 10 million people match the demographics of the approximately 20 million college students. Okay. So this data is actually of higher quality than most of the data we have on voting. Voter turnout among eligible college students increased from 2012 to 2016 by 3 percentage points, from 45.1% to 48.3%, which is a positive development. Even so, that puts college students still 2 points lower than youth voters and 12 points lower than the overall turnout of eligible voters. So there's good progress, but a long way to go still. Now, this group of colleges includes undergraduates, graduates, and non-traditional students. So it's not only the youth group, but the NSOLV data can break it down by age group. And another piece of good news is that the youngest group of college students, those aged 18 to 21, actually saw a 4% increase in their voting between 2012 and 2016. And this is important because we know that once people start voting and get the habit of voting, they're more likely to continue voting in the future. Now, there's some fascinating variation here. Women vote more than men. College students in the Northeast vote more than those in the South. Social science majors vote more than STEM students. Private institutions have higher voting rates, but that may be completely due to the fact that their students are more affluent, and more affluent students are more likely to vote. But there's also variation by institution, with some institutions that really have significantly higher voting rates. So in addition to the quantitative data, NSOLV staff are doing qualitative work, including focus groups on campus, in-depth engagement with colleges that seek their assistance. So one thing the NSOLV data found that some institutions saw an increase as much as 15% between 2012 and 2016. And so it's really important to find out, what are those institutions doing? How can you get an increase in 15% of student voting, even with relatively low levels in the 40s? That's still a massive jump. And they are now exploring about, what's the case? What is that? And there's still research on the way, but they conclude, they say, quote, "We suspect the campus climates, the norms, structures, behaviors, and attitudes of people on campus can influence student decisions whether or not to vote or to be otherwise politically engaged. Based on our research, we hypothesize that pervasive political discussions, strong faculty-student relationships, coupled with political learning across disciplines, and vibrant electoral activities are attributes of a robust campus climate for political engagement." Now, I had dinner last night with some Yale students and faculty, and the Yale students assured me that this vibrant political campus climate existed. They say exists here at Yale. They were very articulate about the kinds of discussions that are going on, the kinds of activities. And I had a chance, I was so interested in this research, I had a chance to talk to the research director, Nancy Thomas, and she confirms the importance of underlying norms and creating a campus climate leading to high voter turnout. and that faculty, students, and administrators all have an important role to play. And Nancy actually said that faculty are critical to voter turnout and that faculty have no idea how important they are. So when they do these focus groups with students, what they find out is in these places that have high school social cohesion and there's high levels of voting, the students are saying things like, we love our classes, we love our professors, we love our campus. And even though there's differences among students, they're not all unified or similar in their backgrounds, but somehow the atmosphere on campus has helped to create this climate where people are more likely to be involved and to vote. And so we know, of course, faculty should never, ever be partisan. But it's very different to tell people who you should vote for, what party you should vote for. That we never do. And to tell people how you vote. I have colleagues who say, well, you don't need to tell Harvard students how to vote. They know how. You don't need to tell them. And reminds me of the joke my husband tells, which is that you can always tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much. But what I've discovered is Harvard students don't necessarily know how to vote. And just like students everywhere, they're sometimes afraid to ask, to be made to feel that they don't know what they should know. And in fact, even my Harvard undergraduate, who read a version of this, wrote me and said that she resonated with what I was saying about people not knowing, because she's very, very capable. She managed to vote absentee in Arizona, where she's from. When she went to Brazil, she managed to switch her absentee voting to be able to vote in Brazil. But now she's stymied, and she can't somehow switch back out of Brazil into a normal absentee voter. So basically, there's a positive and a negative story to tell about voting. The negative story, of course, is that more people did not vote than voted for either of the two candidates in the last election. The positive story is these increases in voting levels, generally among young and among the college. Now, the U.S. system is not the only way to handle it, and I had a long story to tell you here about Latin America, where there's a lot of mandatory voting, and including in Brazil. I'm going to cut most of that story. I just want to tell you one piece of it. In Brazil, there's mandatory voting. You have to get a receipt that gets stamped in order to get government services, and you have to vote. But when you go into the voting machine, you have two buttons that let you protest. One button is, I refuse to vote, and you push it. And the second button is, I vote in blank. Okay? Which are conceptually apparently different issues. So if you refuse to vote, you don't even get counted as having voted. And if you vote in blank, you do get counted as voting in blank. Now, so what I like about that is Brazil has made it very clear how deeply they care about voting. And if you're going to protest, well, then you have to do as much work as it would to vote. You can't feel self-righteous and be lazy at the same time by not voting. And not only that, Brazilians who are never, I've never heard of them being, limited about alcohol, but all alcohol is prohibited starting on midnight the day before elections and going all election day until the polls close. And of course, it's a holiday. So you've got a holiday in Brazil, you've got nothing to drink, and you've got an obligation to vote. And not surprisingly, people do vote. Now, I'm not advocating, I would never advocate mandatory voting in this country. It would just irritate people so much that it would be worse. All I'm pointing out is that some countries take public policy around voting as seriously as the United States government takes, for example, drug policy. They are prepared to take what we would call draconian measures to get people to vote. We are not. We're prepared to take draconian measures to do other things, like try to limit drugs. Okay? So it's not just that they're draconian, we're not. It's what do we believe is important enough to take forceful measures about. So skipping over Brazil. I want to tell one more story, and then I want to end. So first, the reason we need norms we need not just the norm to vote, we need the norm for people to encourage others to vote. Okay? And this is a tough thing. I have a colleague, Alec Kazor, at the Kennedy School, who is, I call him Mr. Right to Vote. He's written an important book on the history of voting and not voting in the United States. And I took him out to lunch, and I said, I'm going to talk about voting. And I said, what do you think of the responsibility to vote? And he actually said, I have a deep discomfort with it. I have a discomfort with, he put it this, he admitted he would have to overcome discomfort in order to actively check in with others in his life and encourage them to vote. But why discomfort? He said it was perhaps because many think it should be left to political parties and campaigns to get out the vote. So it's a matter of parties, campaigns, and candidates, but not individuals. But we can't leave it just, of course it's a matter of parties and campaigns. Okay, we can't leave it just to parties and campaigns. It's exactly because there are active measures to have voter suppression. They're active and they're orchestrated measures at voter suppression, okay, that have made our system very, very difficult for even smart people like my research assistant to maneuver. As such, voters need all the help they can get, not just from parties, not just from candidates, but from their friends, their colleagues, their professors, their fellow students. And that effort needs to be at least equally active and orchestrated as some of the efforts at voter suppression have been. Now, at this point, some of you are thinking that this is a utopian world we'll never see. But think the active discomfort that other norm campaigners had to overcome and that I've read about. Think about norm campaigners campaigning against slavery, the vote for women, or many of the other changes that we now take for granted. Those norm campaigners, obviously, it was not a comfortable discussion to have with your neighbors about slavery. It was not a comfortable discussion to have with the men in your family about why women needed to vote. And yet, norm campaigners on all these campaigns learned how to overcome their discomfort in order to make norm advocacy just part of one's life, important enough to be part of one's life. And what you're asking people to do is really, people in this country spend way more time recycling than they do voting, for example, and they recycle a lot more. And yet voting is I think, arguably much more important. We spend, my students sort of complain about the time, and I just say, how much time did you spend today doing some other irrational waste of time? What about video games? What about reading trashy novels? What about watching bad TV shows? And I speak personally from experience. And they all nod their heads and say, of course, I just wasted time just today doing something else, and yet I can't spend the hour to go to vote. So we know that peer pressure works. People are very persuaded by people around them, by their peer group, to do what they think is the appropriate thing to do. There's a whole body of research in psychology from Ash to Milgram and many others that confirm the importance of peer pressure on decision making. Obviously we don't want people only to vote. We want them, it implies an informed, we want an informed ballot. And that's one reason why I think it's really important to focus on college students, because college students have the education and they have the resources at their disposal. They have their colleagues, they have the libraries, they have their professors in order to really to inform themselves in order to vote. We should also point out that sometimes the barrier to knowledge shouldn't be too high. I used to tell my students, the Water and Conservation Board thing at the end of the ballot, you don't have to vote for that, But I would pull up a ballot for them because I didn't want them to be surprised or freaked out. You can, at the Secretary of State's office in Minnesota, you can pull the ballot up. Here's the ballot. Here's what it'll look like. There's the Water and Conservation Board. But this is what else you're going to have to do, and that helps people when they walk in to do something unfamiliar for some of them, which is voting. So, I'm going to end here because I'm beyond time. But I would just say all of us are connected to the structural problem of voting in this country. And as such, because we are socially connected to the problem, we have diverse responsibilities to collaborate with people, to help people exercise their legal right and their civil responsibility to vote. And so this is our responsibility to ourselves, our country, our communities, and if I may say, to the world. Okay? Why? Because I have so many colleagues around the world who say, if only we could vote in U.S. elections. U.S. elections affect us so much, and yet we have no say. But the people who have a say apparently don't appreciate the importance of their vote. So, thank you. Harold.
So I appreciate the lecture. I wonder why you backed off of saying you would never recommend mandatory voting. So obviously there's something. Why do we recognize a right not to vote? You don't recognize a right not to pay taxes. You don't recognize a right not to do jury duty. In countries that have universal military service, which when we had a mandatory selective service, you don't recognize a right not to register for military service. You might have conscientious objection or whatever. And then vaccination is another example. And on the other side of it, you don't recognize a right of people to vote, or you don't recognize a right of people to, we shouldn't be recognizing a right of people to have 100 guns with machine stocks. Right. So isn't there some zone of collective activity where you're producing some kind of public good, where the idea that there's a right not to do it shouldn't be granted the equal status as the right to do it?
Right. So I've done research on this. 22 countries in the world have a compulsory voting. 14 countries have a duty to vote in their constitution, though there's not complete overlap between those two groups. Okay, you can have a duty to vote in the constitution, but you might not have a compulsory voting and vice versa. Latin American countries are particularly well represented in both groups, and not surprising, they have high participation rates. I guess I actually think that there's a really strong libertarian strain in this country. And I think that if you were to start campaigning for obligatory voting, that you would it's this question of being principled and strategic. I think strategically you would just hit up so much against kind of this libertarian notion of a right to vote and a right not to vote. And you'd spend all your time arguing about that rather than getting to the issue, which I think is a civic responsibility to vote. But if you just feel like we shouldn't, you don't think there'd be a credible pushback if there was a move to make voting obligatory?
Well, again, you say there's some things like, as you say, you could have a requirement to go to the polls and push, I refuse to vote for anybody in the ballot. You at least fulfill the civic responsibility. It's like saying, I don't feel like going to jury duty. Let other people go to jury duty. We have criminal penalties if you don't go to jury duty.
Yeah.
So where does the U.S. on the countries that don't mandate it? Where does the U.S. on democracies? What's the range of the 50 to 60%? Is that
on our voting? Okay, that's the research I should have done and didn't do. But in general, U.S. voting turnout is lower than most major democracies in the world. Okay, so we're known for having a low voter turnout.
Yeah, we don't care.
And I think it has to do more with some of the complications of our electoral system. It has to do with some things I spoke about, with this two-party presidential system. So we know that parliamentary systems with proportional representation often get more people mobilized to vote, right? Because a small group that votes for the Green Party, if they get over a threshold, let's say, they'll get representation in Congress. Where here people feel like they aren't getting representative because we have a presidential system, single-member districts, where the all small parties are crushed out. So I think that U.S. low voting may be due to a series of the nature of our political system more than necessarily the unresponsiveness of people. Sheila?
I appreciate the lecture, and I very much agree with the spirit behind it. But in a sense, your answer now raises the institutional question. And I'm wondering why you're being so shy about it. Not just mandatory voting, but Disillusionment with the system has a lot to do, right, with staying at home, enthusiasm. We know that probably the bump that you talked about in the youth vote had a lot to do with Bernie's candidacy, right? So how irrational is it actually for the voter to feel that there are systemic blockages? Okay, we know that Hillary Clinton got 2.5 million more votes, right, than our current president. And yet there is a kind of shyness in the discourse that we are having about institutions. Why? I mean, I'm remembering Robert Dahl's little book that was part of the Castle section. He said, "How democratic is the American Constitution?" I mean, I'm here in the presence of Harold Cohen and others, you know, who may set me right, but there really are elements built in to our system, which is to discourage increased popular participation. We are not civic republican in the sense in which, you know, some of the Latin American models are. Let's just some of the institutional issues. Right now, we are told that the gerrymandering system is such that congressional seats, the number of congressional seats that will swing, possibly swing in 2018 is just very, very low. So districts are locked in, and that's the case before the Supreme Court. Now, that's incredibly important in a democracy, right? If you really do feel that nothing, that your vote cannot shift that situation, you get very discouraged. Proportional representation. Lani Guinier put this issue on the docket about 15 years ago. She was chased out of court as if she was saying nobody should have a vote. So I guess my question to you is, why not be a bit more institutionally radical and say this is a time when we have to ask these questions? Because I agree with you that I think this is the time of the worst threat to American democracy I certainly have ever experienced, and I came to this country in 1970. You know, we are about to lose the republic. So why shouldn't we be you know, more radical in our institutional thinking?
Well, I'm taking this on one as a series of lectures about responsibility. Okay, first. And so this is one piece of a broader set of lectures. I'm not primarily interested or primarily skilled to talk about, but in which I'm arguing that in all cases, structural institutional issues matter, and that people are working on them, and that they're important. But somehow we're always using them as I think individuals are using them in this way, where we talk about the theories and we don't have to discuss personal responsibility. And I just feel like the difficulty of increasing our vote. We have such a wide margin. 80% of young people did not vote in midterms. You know, that's a huge gap there. And the amount, and a lot of those people are, 45% are, I think actually 60% are registered. So even without registering a single new person, you could get a dramatic increase in voting in the midterms with no additional, change in institutions, just getting people to the polls, okay? And so of course I think we should think about these others, but I'm enough of a kind of a realistic political scientist, student of comparative politics to know, guess what? Those institutional features are really, really hard to change. There are very few examples, and Francis here is going to say very few examples in the world where mature modern democracies have done some major revamping of their political system. Okay, and it does usually come after major crises and wars, but I don't see it's a very likely scenario that we're going to get PR system, that we're going to get obligatory voting. I think it's fine to struggle for those, that we're going to get rid of the Electoral College. We know the barriers to that institutional change are extremely high. And we have one issue at our disposal that is both, I think, ethically the right thing to do. I think it's ethically the right thing to do, to ask people to step forward and take responsibility. And people are always saying, they're so disillusioned. And here I have to bring up my Latin American experience, I'm sorry, have you ever lived in a country without a democracy? Do you know what it's like to live in real authoritarianism? Do you know what it's like to be afraid to, that your friends are being taken away and tortured? And so some of it is some of this disillusionment is this comparison to these ideals we have of democracy. And it's wonderful for us to struggle for ideals. But the notion that I'm so disillusioned I can't spend a half an hour to go to vote, what's that about? Yes.
Hi, to return to your idea about that individual responsibility to vote and the disillusionment, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in how that factors into like local and state elections as well, because theoretically I'd say that then in local elections you have more of an ability to be like, oh, I feel represented, I'm able to like have a bit more say. I don't have access to those numbers right now. I would be very surprised to hear that those are higher than any national averages.
Very low voter turnout in elections, and actually huge possibility of impact. And if you'll permit me to tell my one final story of the day, and I have permission to use his name to tell it, my colleague Steve Walt at the Kennedy School, some of you know him. His wife is extremely involved in local politics, and there was a local election. She was supporting, she had strong people she was supporting for city council, 2 women for city council. And she just told him, go vote for these people. He drove in the driveway, 6:30, and he remembered he hadn't voted. So he turned around, Brighton was open until 7. He votes. The next day he learns that one of the candidates won by 1 vote. 1 vote. His vote, he thinks. Well, so, of course, then the person insisted on a recount. The opponent insisted on a recount. They recount, and they won by 3 votes. Okay? But there are local elections where literally these elections are being decided by 1 vote or 3 votes. So they're exactly the place where one can have the most difference. And it's certainly for families with young children, these school decisions are being made locally. But for important environmental decisions are being made as well. And so it's exactly an example where it's not at all irrational to vote if you care about those local issues. Yeah, John.
Does it work for a country or state or other jurisdiction to offer some sort of incentive or bonus or reward for voting?
I know people have played around with that one. Someone was telling me about does anyone know? There's been some experiments done with it. But incentives backfire. There's a psychological literature where we actually know that sometimes where you offer money for something, people value it less. And I think it's a dangerous thing to go the route of paying people to vote. And it's and so I would not recommend it. I mean, we have incredible, really, to be a citizen in this country, you have incredible privileges and rights, whatever our disillusionment, compared to citizens in many, many parts of the world, we have incredible privileges and rights. And to suggest you'd have to pay your citizens to go vote, it seems ethically problematic. And I think practically not effective.
Were you thinking of underprivileged or people who have an economic cost associated to voting?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, monetary payment. It can be some sort of, some other sort of incentive.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Walt's wife.
Yes, the young man here.
So different states have vastly different voter turnout. I think Minnesota's always at the top with like 75%. I think this last election Hawaii had 40%. So like a 35% gap. I don't know if you've said this, but do you see different norms about voting within states and different methods that or things that foster this culture where certain...
The institutional changes that we can make that could be made, that are realistic to make, are changes in voter registration. Same-day voter registration yields higher voter turnout. All the big high turnout states, with a few exceptions like Massachusetts, all of them have same-day voter registration. It's a reasonable policy. It's been adopted by a lot of states, and it is effective. We've got so that would be one that I would highly recommend that people should be lobbying and working on. But it's being resisted, as you know, because this whole feeling that it could lead to fraud, even though there's no evidence it leads to fraud. But so a motor voter stuff also is effective. So when people go to get their driver's license, to get them to have them register to vote at that time is another very effective and very costly, low cost method. So
Do Do you see difference in norms about voting though among these populations? Like within states that all have same-day registration, there's still going to be variants. Like, have you seen within different regions, like?
Yeah, so I'm from Minnesota. You heard I'm from Minnesota.
Oh,
Minnesota's okay. So we're Minnesotans, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about norms in Minnesota?
I mean, people have a very strong, I don't know, people like are I think the state government is viewed positively, which plays a big role. But like in my school, Eden Prairie, everyone voted, and the teachers always told us we had to vote, and we'd be lectured if we didn't, and so forth. But
Yeah.
I lived in other states, so I couldn't tell you if it's in
Right, exactly. So, 74%, that's what Minnesota has. It's highest in the nation, it's always highest in the nation. And yes, there's a civic culture of a norm to vote. And that, a civic culture can push you at least from 60%, the average up to 74. Yeah. Yes.
Do you think the small percentages in voter gains is indicative that some norms are kind of changing amongst young people? Because you mentioned, and of course, like, hopefully that trend is upward, but you mentioned that in Argentina and Latin American countries that a lot of people value the right to vote after seeing their friends and relatives and family members get like disappeared and snatched, and that's very much happening under Trump's administration. So what do you think are indicators for norm changing?
I think it depends on how people frame things. If they frame it as more disillusionment, or most dangerously, if they frame it as a need for violence, then that could, take people, out of the voting system. But I think, and just from talking to Yale students last night, I think that there is among some groups of young people and on some campuses, I think there's an emerging culture that will begin to place more emphasis. But I don't know, even back in Minnesota, back at the University of Minnesota, when I told my colleagues, I said, voting day is coming near. It's the time we all need to explain to our students how to vote. And they went, you do what? Like, they thought that was like kind of, wow, that's interesting. I never thought of that. And saying, there's the Secretary of State has a great, you just go in class, you pull up the Secretary of State's website. You say, put in your zip code. It tells you the address of where to go to vote. Pull up your ballot. You know exactly what it's going to look like when you walk in, so you can prepare for it. Bring your gas bill along, because that's the ID you're going to need if you don't have a government issue ID. But people, that was not the norm among political scientists. So if it's not the norm among political scientists, what's the norm? In any other department. If a political scientist can't sort of say, this is part of my, the universities have as a mission civic engagement. It should not be considered at all a partisan act to walk into class and say, today we're going to talk about how to vote. And yet, apparently people are not doing it or seeing that it's inappropriate in a college. And I think I just think it has to be changed. Okay, keep going. Yeah, Harold and Sheila again. Let's go another round.
I want to take another run at my question.
Yeah, okay.
So you treat this as a question of a right to vote and a responsibility to vote. And what I think I was asking was, why do you assume there's a right not to vote? And isn't part of this to say that the claim that there's a right not to vote is a fiction, just like there's a right not to pay your taxes or a right not to go to a jury? So for example, in the smoking setting, one of the arguments that was made is, I have a right to smoke. And then they say, we have a right to advertise, and that our libertarian impulses are too powerful, we cannot possibly stop that. Until it became clear that the externalities and negative externalities made it appropriate for government regulation to stop advertising.
Right.
Or someone says, I have a right for my child not to be vaccinated, and everybody has that right. And the net result of that is you have a huge number of unvaccinated people walking around, and that creates externality. So we often have situations where when people are asserting rights, as they're doing again now, I have a right to own as many guns as I want, because I have a Second Amendment right that my libertarian impulses make that so powerful.
Right.
Obviously, when these rights have these incredibly negative externalities and damage the public good, there has to be some limit on it. So maybe one way to address it is not simply to say you have a responsibility to vote, but deny that there is a right not to vote. I mean, if you have to go in Brazil to the polling station and push, I don't vote for anybody, that's like going to a jury duty and sitting there and not serving on the jury.
Yeah. All I can say is when I did the research on the history of duties and rights, there's a distinct Anglo-American tradition, which is rights versus rights. So this is the smoking issue, right? In the end, it was, you have the right to smoke, but I have my right to health is more important, and that trumps your right to smoke, right? So the Anglo-American tradition is very much this rights versus rights tradition. And we constrain people's rights by harm they're doing to others, right? In Latin America, which is all of these mandatory voting are all Latin America, they have a long tradition of what I call the rights and duties tradition. Okay, it's in their constitution. It came from Spain. Okay, so that mandatory voting is something that has a whole history behind it that we don't have here. And so I love your idea. It's not like I'm opposed to it. I think it's a great idea. I'd love to have a voting machine in this country that people could walk into and push, I refuse to vote. I think that would be fabulous. But I just don't think it's going to happen. And as such, I'm recommending that we do everything possible to enhance voting via voluntary means. And I think voluntary means are more powerful than people give them credit for. So I keep giving these examples. How do we go from these amazing changes we've seen in this country of from not no one even knowing what recycling was to in Massachusetts at least, recycling everywhere. How have we created this norm change? I mean, you guys all must have it too. Norm change is recycling, right? You're holding a bottle and you're like getting the creeps because you're going to have to throw it in a trash bin, and it's just making you almost. No, does anyone else have that reaction? Am I the only one? But you know what I mean. Why do we feel that way about something important but not as important as voting? And we don't, why is it that people just don't get a sense of deep, anxiety because they haven't been able to vote? I don't know. Yes?
I want to sort of continue a little bit on this train of thought, and I agree with your argument, but I think maybe a better sort of way to think about it, and I take very seriously the comments by Shayla and Harold about, why don't we dream bigger, right? Because you started by telling us, these people thought they were crazy when they were lobbying for these norms. The people that thought, let's get rid of slavery, they didn't think this is, feasible. They thought, this is, am I crazy for fighting this? And they were fighting really insurmountable challenges. So why can't we think bigger? Why can't we think, let's push it? And there are people doing it. Your colleague Larry Lessig at Harvard is being he's really trying to think how do I get rid of the Electoral College? And people are actually, so this is a moment where people are trying to push bigger. But I think that is compatible with what you're trying to say. And maybe what we need is to, first, once everybody gets more used to voting and that norm's been embedded, then we can tackle some institutional and more of this, you know what, we actually don't have a right not to vote. Right. And so maybe we need to, maybe it's like your norm cascade theory, we gotta, in order for the big cascade to happen, you need some build up towards that. So, it's not, I think that you're both right? I think that I agree with your proposition that this is what's maybe feasible right now, but I also don't think that you should limit yourself by saying this is all we should be doing, because I think for ethical, political reasons, we also should think deeper about the requirements of democracy and not just by what can be achieved right now. Right.
No, that's a terrific point. And I should say, I do not believe these are mutually exclusive. I totally don't think they're mutually exclusive. Okay, but I do think that what I'm saying we can start this tomorrow. They've started it already. Nancy Thomas and her operation, she said, and tell them anyone wants me to come down to Yale and talk about our research. And you guys have received the Yale report from Unsolv. Somewhere it's there. It has all the information exactly about what percentage of people, Yale students, are voting. And they can't give it to me, but they can give it to you, because that's the deal of how it works. But so they should totally not be mutually exclusive. And there's amazing stories in the history of campaigns of how people start out modest. Like my favorite is women's suffrage African women's suffrage started with the idea that married women didn't need to vote, for example, because, hey, married women are being represented by their husbands, you know? And when you look back, you went like, what were they thinking of? But so there are many proposals should be moving ahead, okay? Many proposals, and they're not mutually exclusive. But one of those proposals must be about dramatically enhancing voting through, I think, normative campaigns around the absolute importance of the right to vote. But can we work for mandatory voting? You know, we should definitely try. Anyway, Shelley, you had another question.
No, I just wanted to bring up two examples of institutional proposals for reform that are going on at the present, and they are quite minimal, but they mediate a little bit between the big picture and what can we do now. One of them is obviously that the whole issue of redistricting, and I'm very worried about it because the Supreme Court is sitting on it now, but California and a bunch of other states have given it to an independent commission. Okay, so one can make this proposal on a bipartisan basis on the grounds of fairness, equity, transparency, etc. That's one step. The other is something I wanted to ask you about. Apparently, Alec Kaiser is part of a movement that is trying to get states to sign on that the candidate that has been elected in the state will then become, for the majority state, that it will become binding on the Electoral College. I'm not expressing this very well, but he's apparently trying to get the majority candidate of them. Do you know about this proposal, which is?
I don't know enough about it. I just know a little about it. And that, again, much more realistic than changing the Electoral College is the idea that what's not mandated is this notion that the electors couldn't divide their votes to reflect and there are a number of states have done it already, and so it's absolutely possible that one could campaign more for that, right? And the dilemma is that the states that only some states will campaign for it, and others won't, and it might in fact disadvantage some of the various states that are campaigning for it. So, any final? Yes.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the relationship between the proliferation of communication technology and social media platforms on the likelihood of a sort of bottom-up norm emergence, like you're talking about. Because on the one hand, you can see it sort of facilitating the type of peer pressure that you need in order to kind of give people positive affirmations to vote. On the other hand, you can see a sort of countervailing pressure with social media where people get the opportunity to kind of perform their political commitments in a sort of low-cost way and then get lots of affirmation for it in a way that makes it kind of more attractive than voting. Right. So, I think you're absolutely right that social media has sometimes played a double role, right? And that is sometimes it can be used to mobilize, and sometimes it can be used to privatize, right? Privatize and give the impression of activity, political activity, without having to do anything aside from play with your computer or your phone, right? But there's fabulous examples, including sad examples in Egypt and elsewhere, where social media was a huge tool for public mobilizing of individuals. And there's no reason why social media could not be harnessed to this campaign, of creating new norms about responsibility to vote. And young people like yourself are the ones that are going to think about how would that be, how would you do that? If you were really trying to think about how you would persuade your, friends and fellow students to vote. I mean, the question is, do we even know if people are voting? How would one even begin to do that? How would we begin to do that?
Yeah, using social media.
So I mean, it did seem like I noticed much more this last election cycle that people were much more vocal about the fact that they were voting, and then they would get affirmation from their friends that was
okay. So the likes and things, yeah,
sure. Like I voted button on Facebook. So I think we do observe those types of tools.
And you hadn't seen that before. The people mentioning that they'd voted.
It's very possible that that was much more common before, but I'm also an embarrassingly late comer to Facebook.
Okay. Right. No, I think social media could be a tool. It could be an important tool for this, but it sort of depends on what the campaign is and how they're doing it.
Beware of the Russian hackers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Troll farms.
Well, Kathryn, do you want to have the last word?
No, just that I really appreciate people's comments and suggestions, and this, is part of a book project, and so I've been taking down your reactions, and I will take them very, very much into account. And Bill is here; he's going to be my editor for this at Yale, and he's here too, hearing what you have to say. And so, so thank you for those remarks. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.